folks, and welcome to Mountain Talk here on WMMT. I'm your host, Parker Hobson. So, March is Women's History Month, and so here on this week's show, we thought we'd bring you visits with two remarkable Appalachian women. Back in the 1990s, we here at WMMT put together a 15-part radio series spotlighting Appalachian women writers that was called Tell It on the Mountain. And each episode of the series features interviews with and readings from a wide range of women writers from here in the region. And today on Mountain Talk, we bring you two different episodes from the Tell It on the Mountain series. First, we'll visit with the world-famous Kentucky writer Barbara Kingsolver. And then in the second half of the show, we'll hear from the writer Mary Lee Settle, who grew up in both Pineville, Kentucky, as well as Charleston, West Virginia. This series was produced by former WMMT producer Maxine Kenny, and it was hosted by the incomparable Appalachian poet and writer Nikki Giovanni, who, sadly, we lost last winter. But here's today's first episode, featuring Barbara Kingsolver.
I was principally an activist during my 20s. That was the main thing I did, and I still think of myself in the same way. I don't feel that I've changed at all. It's just that back then I wrote pamphlets and cranked out mimeographed leaflets. Now I write novels instead. But I don't think my job description has fundamentally changed.
I'm Nikki Giovanni, your host for Tell It on the Mountain, a series of programs featuring women writers who call the Southern Appalachian Mountains home. Today, our featured artist is Barbara Kingsolver, novelist, short story writer, and poet. She now makes her home in Tucson, Arizona, but she grew up in the rolling hills that divide the coal fields of eastern Kentucky from the opulent horse farms of the Kentucky bluegrass. It was from this vantage point that Kingsolver saw the great divide between the haves and the have-nots. Kingsolver says these childhood impressions continue to direct her to a life of activism on social issues and to her characters, people who live on the borderline. Kingsolver writes serious literature about the things two women might talk about at the kitchen table. Her fiction resonates with the myths and stories that are a part of everyday life. At the center of her story are women's lives, of their need for independence as well as dependence, of self and unselfishness, of emotion and reason. With her writing, Barbara Kingsolver joins a strong tradition in Appalachian literature in which the writer becomes the voice of the common people and a mirror for society.
Every significant contribution, literary contribution does change the world in one way or another. I grew up among people who, in literary terms, are the disenfranchised. I never read literature. I never read books in school, or anywhere for that matter, that were about me, that were about people whose main projects in life were stripping tobacco and, getting the hay in before the rain and making pies for a neighbor's wake. I mean, these were the things life revolved around, and I didn't ever see such lives or such people in the books I read. The things I read were written by old dead men from England, and my impression was that literature was about people in starched white collars and people who rode horses and saved the day and people who chased great white whales, and it was never about what happened between a couple of women in a kitchen. So I didn't think of myself as really living or knowing lives that were the stuff of literature, and I carried that misapprehension for most of my life because I didn't see it contradicted anywhere. No one taught me that. No one ever stood up in the front of a class and said no one would ever write a great book about Kentucky, because in fact there were people doing just that. There was Jessie Stewart and Harriet Arno and quite a lot of other people doing that, but I didn't know about them, and I don't think they were widely recognized at the time. So I suppose that was a kind of disenfranchisement that's not explicit. We weren't sort of the disenfranchisement poster children. But in the early 80s, I was casting around I was unconsciously trying very hard to find a voice. And I read Bobby Ann Mason, I read Shiloh and Other Stories, which I think came out in 1981, and it stunned me. It just it made me sit down and take a deep breath. And I felt like crying because I understood how then, for the first time, because she writes with such, I think, enormous respect and reverence for the Kentucky people, the quite ordinary people she grew up amongst. And I realized what I'd been trying so hard to throw away. You know, I've been trying to pull out of Kentucky like a lizard shedding its skin, and I had nearly done it. I think that I sort of reclaimed it by the skin of my teeth, and I began right then, almost on the spot, writing about, not just about Kentucky, but about what I think of as Kentucky themes and, you know, sort of the southern sense of connectedness to people and to the land, and return to the territory of the true territory of my childhood and of my psyche as it remains, which is writing about community. And for the first time I started writing things that seemed at least a little bit palatable, that had a little bit of emotional resonance. When it did occur to me that I might be able to write, you know, literature with a capital L, or even a small L, that I might be able to write books, I wanted very much to give voice to these people I'd come up among, and to remind them and remind myself and the rest of the world that our language is beautiful and our lives are honorable. I've been living in Tucson, Arizona for about 15 years, but it's always such a relief to come home to where people talk the right way. Something happened in early 80s. I read a collection of short stories by Bobby Ann Mason. It's called Shiloh and Other Stories, and they're all set in Kentucky, and they're all about the most ordinary people you could possibly imagine. People like us. And she had written about them with such affection and respect that my jaw dropped. And I realized that I'd been trying for 10 years to leave behind the most precious thing I possibly could have. And that was a place to belong to and an accent. And shortly after that, I wrote a story that was kind of a turning point for me. It's the first time I really let myself write about people who I might have known growing up, and a place that might have been the place I lived. And I decided that tonight I'd read you that story as a way of honoring my chance to be back here, as a way of paying homage to the fact that the exotic and terrible and wonderful things I'd always wanted to write about were in my backyard. The story is called Rose Johnny, and it's in this book called Homeland. Rose Johnny wore a man's haircut and terrified little children, although I will never believe that was her intention. For her own part, she inspired in us only curiosity. It was our mothers who took this fascination and wrung it through daily admonitions into the most irresistible kind of horror. She was like the old wells, covered with ancient rotting boards and overgrown with weeds, that waited behind the barns to swallow us down. Our mothers warned us time and again not to go near them, and still we're certain that we did. My own mother was not one of those who had a great deal to say about her, but Walnut Knobs was a small enough town so that a person did not need to be told things directly. When I had my first good look at her at close range, I was 10 years old. I fully understood the importance of the encounter. What mattered to me at the time, though, was that it was something my sister had not done before me. She was 5 years older, and as a consequence there was hardly an achievement in my life, nor an article of clothing, that had not first been Marietta's. But because of the circumstances of my meeting Rose Johnny, I couldn't tell a living soul about it, and so for nearly a year I carried the secret torment of a great power that can't be used. My agitation was not relieved, but made worse when I told the story to myself over and over again. She was not, as we always heard, half man and half woman, something akin to the pagan creatures whose naked torsos are inserted in various shocking ways into parts of animal bodies. In fact, I was astonished by her ordinariness. It is true that she wore red-winged boots like my father, and also there was something not quite womanly in her face, but maybe any woman's face would look the same with that haircut. Her hair was coal black, cut flat across the top of her round head so that when she looked down I could see a faint pale spot right on top where the scalp almost surfaced. But the rest of her looked exactly like anybody's mother in a big flowered dress without a waistline and with two faded spots in front where her bosom rubbed over the counter when she reached across to make change or wipe away the dust. People say there is a reason for every important thing that happens. I was sent to the feed store where I spoke to Rose Johnny and passed a quarter from my hand into hers because it was haying time and because I was small for my age. I was not too small to help with tobacco setting in the spring. In fact, I was better at it than Marietta, who complained about the stains on her hands. But I was not yet big enough to throw a bale of hay onto the flatbed. It was the time of year when Daddy complained about not having boys. Mama said that at least he oughtn't to bother going into town for the chicken mash that day because George Ann could do it on her way home from school. Mama told me to ask Aunt Minnie to please, ma'am, give me a ride home. Ask her nice to stop off at Lester Wall's store so you can run in with this quarter and get 5 pounds of laying mash. I went to college in Greencastle, Indiana, and discovered to my dismay that I had a southern accent. See, we always grew up thinking or knowing full well that Kentucky was not the South. Kentucky was a border state. The South was those other people way, way below us on the map who flew the Confederate flag. But as soon as I left Kentucky, people said, "Oh, get real, you're from the South." And the way I spoke was, it struck people as first humorous. People couldn't hear what I was saying because they were so fascinated and disdainful of the way I said it. And this was a shock to me. I never knew that that's the way we were being perceived in the rest of the world. I mean, when I was a kid, I read Little Abner, just like everybody else, and I thought he was hilarious, just like everybody else, but it never dawned on me that there were people in the world, a great majority of them, in fact, who thought that anyone who said all and har and holler had the cranial capacity of Daisy May, and that there could be no two ways about it. So yeah, I lost my accent, and I didn't do it on purpose. It just kind of went away because I was became so sort of defensive of that perception. I like to write about multicultural communities and multicultural issues and the different ways that different sorts of people can look at the same event and carry away different meanings or judgments or tasks. And where I live now in Tucson is a really rich substrate for this kind of writing and thinking because I live among people who have come there from Iowa, and people who've come there from El Salvador, people who've come from Mexico, people who have lived there since it was Mexico. I have friends who are Navajo, friends who are Apache, friends who are Tohono O'odham. All of us living there in one little boiling pot, produces a wonderful kind of soup. And so I do find myself writing about people of different traditions, different ethnic backgrounds, people who grew up with different creation myths, because I think it's so interesting to think about how our myths form us. I have a tiny little bit of Cherokee blood in my family, like almost everyone in the Southeast. Half the people I went to school with claim to be descended from Sacagawea. So, people continually ask me if I am part Cherokee, and I say I'm as Cherokee as apple pie and Elvis. I'm going to read a little bit from somewhere in the middle of Pigs in Heaven. This is a conversation between Anawake Fourkiller, who is the attorney for the Cherokee Nation, who has recognized that the tribe has an interest in the adopted daughter of another character, Taylor Greer. Taylor has fled with her daughter to keep Anawake from whatever she might do in terms of claiming her daughter. So Anawake has arrived at her house to find her gone, and she has this conversation with Taylor's boyfriend, Jax. They're sitting on the front steps and have noticed the 7 sisters. The what? Anawake says. Pleiades, the 7 sisters. Anawake takes a long pull on her beer and squints at the sky. You people must have better eyes than we do. In Cherokee there are only 6, the 6 bad boys. Anisutsa. Anitsutsa? Yeah, or Disigwa, the pigs. The 6 pigs in heaven. Excuse me, Jack says, but you're making this up. No, there's a story about these 6 boys that wouldn't do their work. Wouldn't work in the corn, wouldn't fix their mother's roofs, wouldn't do the ceremony chores. There's always stuff to be done at the ceremonial grounds, getting firewood and repairing shelters and things like that. They weren't what you'd call civic-minded. And they got turned into pigs? Now wait, Anawake says, don't jump ahead. It's their fault they turned themselves into pigs. See, all they wanted to do ever was play ball and have fun, all day long. So their mothers got fed up. They got together one day and gathered up all the boys' swalesdi balls. It's a little leather ball about like this. Anawake holds up a green apricot. With hair inside. Animal hair, human, whatever. And they put all the balls in the stew pot. They cooked them. Yum yum, says Jax. Anawake throws the apricot, carefully aiming at nothing. Okay, she says. So the boys come home for lunch after playing around all morning, and their mothers say, "Here's your soup." They plop these soggy old cooked balls down on their plates. So the boys get mad. They say, "Forget it, only a pig would eat this." And they rush down to the ceremonial grounds and start running around and around the ball court, asking the spirits to listen, yelling that their mothers are treating them like pigs. And the spirits listened, I guess. They figured, well, a mother knows best, and they turned the boys into pigs. They ran faster and faster till they were just a blur. Their little hooves left the ground, and they rose up into the sky, and there they are. Holy crow, Jack says. Your mom tell you that when you wouldn't make your bed? My Uncle Ledger, she says. There's a lot of different versions of all the stories, according to what mood you're in, but you're right, that's the general idea. The pigs, and also Uktena, this big snake with horns. Those are the Cherokee boogeymen. I was always very civic-minded when I lived with my uncle. So that's your guiding myth, Jack says. Do right by your people or you'll be a pig in heaven. Anawake thinks this over. Yeah, I had 101 childhood myths, and they all added up more or less to do right by your people. Is that so bad? What are yours? Oh, you know, Jack says. I heard the usual American thing. If you're industrious and have clean thoughts, you will grow up to be vice president of Motorola. Do right by yourself, in other words, Anawake says. Jax finishes the last half of his beer in one swallow. She watches his Adam's apple with amazement. You think Taylor's being selfish, he states. Anawake hesitates. There are so many answers to that question. Selfish is a loaded word, she says. I've been off the reservation. I know the story. There's this kind of moral argument for doing what's best for yourself. I think it would be hard to do anything else. Your culture is one long advertisement for how to treat yourself to the life you really deserve, whether or not you actually deserve it. True, Jack says. We all ought to be turned into pigs. Anawake's mouth forms a tight, upside-down smile. Some of my best friends are white people, she says. I do find myself interested, though. I find myself coming back again and again to the home ground and the home terrain of community versus individualism and how to reconcile those two things. And it's almost inevitable that I let Native American characters speak in my books on behalf of community, because these characters are people who really know what community is in some of the same ways and in some different ways from the way people in eastern Kentucky know what community is. I look for that. I feel like I have a kind of X-ray vision for people who belong to a group, people who really know what it means never to let the needs or the ambitions or the accomplishments of the individual rise too far above the good of the group. have been watershed experiences in my life. One of them certainly was the Vietnam War. I think that was a watershed experience for a whole lot, half the people walking around on this earth, at least in this country today. My experience of it was very different from people who are maybe half a generation older than me. I got to college in 1973, and that, as Robert Frost says, has made all the difference. I know that people had been struggling along opposing that war for a decade, really, but I didn't know that. I mean, I had been in high school in Nicholas County, Kentucky, and my main line of information about the Vietnam War was the Reader's Digest, and articles like The Blood Red Hands of Ho Chi Minh. So I didn't know anything. I was just as ignorant as the day is long. And I got to college and suddenly sort of learned everything really fast and was mortified by the fact that my country was waging this awful war, this immoral and horrible war. And along with my peers, I marched out to the street and demanded an end to the war, and bang, it stopped. That summer, Nixon resigned and the war ended. And it was a tremendous, I guess you would say, classical, in terms of classical conditioning, it was a tremendous positive reinforcement. And I swear, ever since then, I've felt that if something makes you mad, you should get out in the street and yell about it, and it'll end. It'll stop. I persist in feeling that way, even though it hasn't quite been rewarded in the same way since. But I think, that's sort of an obvious watershed for something that I think probably is a trait that was bred into me by my family, which is that if you don't like the way something is, if you don't like something about the world, you should be a part of the solution rather than part of the problem. And I think my college years directed me in terms of activism. And so when I moved to Tucson, I was ready to understand things about U.S. foreign policy in Latin America. I was ready to hear and to learn about the horrible and immoral ways my tax dollars were being used there in places like Chile, El Salvador, Nicaragua, Guatemala. And in fact, I met a lot of people, a lot of my friends in Tucson were people from the refugee community. And when the horrific results of your country's foreign policy are sitting in your living room telling you the miserable stories of their lives, the terrible things that have happened simply because my country has dropped a bomb on theirs, either literally or figuratively, you can't stay passive about something like that, and you can't claim politics as an abstraction, as so many people in this country seem to do. Politics is lives. It's justice or the lack of it. It's some people with more money than they know what to do with living in the neighborhood of people who have nothing. So that those personal connections I made very soon after moving to Tucson provided for me another watershed and another outlet for my earnest heart. This is a poem called Your Mother's Eyes. It's the last poem in a poetry collection called Another America. The poems appear in both English and Spanish. This poem is dedicated to a Nicaraguan woman named Lesbia Lopez and her daughter Maura. Your Mother's Eyes. Maura, I have dreamed of your life. There are lilies as red as blood, as a sunrise, that only grow from scarred earth after a fire. Maura, your mother was 16, without thoughts of you, when they caught her painting walls, painting the oldest kind of tomorrow in colors she found only inside her eyes. When your mother was 16, this was a crime. Maura, she will never tell you everything they did to her in prison, the men, the pants tucked into boots, the pain, the way she watched him tuck his shirt tail in while she wondered what she would ever find to love again. Soon after this, she began to think of you. Maura, there were people who said you should not be born, that a life conceived in hatred is more hate than life. Your mother said, the seed is the least of a tree that has lived through several seasons. Even before the first bud opens, the seed is not what it was. and so you were born. And in the season that brought you into the light, they rang every bell in the country down to the sea and promised kindness, the oldest kind of tomorrow. Even the men in boots were treated with kindness. Maura, you have your mother's eyes. We've come to define political in this country in a very narrow way. Political means counter to the mainstream. And it's interesting to me that much of my writing, much of my fiction, though it is fiction, it's not mimeographed pamphlets, and I do understand the difference, I think. It gets called political, and this question comes up again and again about whether or not art is allowed to be political, whether this is some sort of grievous breach of manners. Every work of fiction espouses a worldview. An action adventure movie espouses a worldview, and it suggests things about how problems can be solved. A romance novel espouses a worldview. It suggests things about relationships between men and women, solutions to certain sorts of problems, what problems there are or are not. I'm doing the same thing, and you can't help it. I mean, if you open your mouth, you're going to say something. You're going to espouse a worldview. So it's interesting that in this country we get kind of delicate about fiction that espouses a worldview that maybe nudges people to question what they have come to believe is true, or to look a little bit harder at the things they think are true, or to look a little bit harder at the things they know in the back of their minds are troubling them and maybe need to be addressed in their own lives and in the way they relate to the rest of the world. I don't know why we're so nervous about that in this country, about art that addresses so-called political issues. In the rest of the world, that's just about all artists do. It's what people expect of their artists. In Latin America, people elect poets to public office. In this country, poets are, the people that if you're dating one, you don't tell your mother. But the rest of the world, I think, has a very healthy notion that questions of social justice and social change and human power relations are fundamentally the domain of art. We're just a little backward here, but we're catching up.
Our series, Tell It on the Mountain, and this feature on the life and work of writer Barbara Kingsolver was produced by Maxine Kenny at WMMT, the public radio station of Appalshop in Whitesburg, Kentucky. Kingsolver read from Homeland and Other Stories and Pigs in Heaven, HarperCollins Publishers. Special thanks for the production help of Gary Slimp, Kate Larkin, and Stephanie Whetstone.
We're going to take a short break here to hear from some folks who make this radio station possible. But stay tuned for more Mountain Talk after the break. Welcome back to Mountain Talk here on WMMT. I'm Parker Hobson. Today, in honor of March being Women's History Month, we're bringing you selections from the 1995 WMMT radio series, Tell It on the Mountain, a series which showcases Appalachian women writers. Up next, series host Nikki Giovanni will bring us our second segment today, which spotlights the writer Mary Lee Settle, who grew up in both Pineville, Kentucky, as well as Charleston, West Virginia.
I never was called a woman writer. I think once you enter into the world of writing, what does it matter what sex you take in with you?
I'm Nikki Giovanni, your host for Tell It on the Mountain, a series of programs featuring women writers who call the Southern Appalachian Mountains home. Today, our featured artist is Mary Lee Settle, a writer of novels and nonfiction, who makes her home in Charlottesville, Virginia. Settle grew up in the coal fields of eastern Kentucky and West Virginia. and she dabbled in acting and high-fashion modeling before turning to a lifetime of writing. Now in her 70s, National Book Award winner Mary Lee Settle has lived through some turbulent years in American and European history, much of which she documents in impeccably researched historical fiction. 5 of her acclaimed novels are called the Beulah Quintet. These collected works trace the history of several Appalachian families, from their roots in Cromwell's England to the coal towns of West Virginia. Settle's most recently published novel, Choices, follows one woman's involvement in the great social movements of the 20th century. In her work, Mary Lee Settle proves everyday events are not always what they seem, and that economics, history, and class dominate our everyday lives. Having been born to it, she delights in criticizing the class of people she describes as the mountain gentility.
When I hear somebody say, I want to be a writer, I think they're balmy. I never wanted to. I don't like doing it. It takes more energy than any other thing I have ever done in my life. I don't know what creativity is. I think we've all got a part of our brain and soul and mind that makes things up, you know. Whatever you make with your mind or your hands that is, in effect, something out of nothing is what I call creative. I don't care whether it's an apple pie or a rug or a book or whatever. It requires a certain occupied concentration, which I'm sure one day will be found to be a part of the brain. I think we've all got it. And some of us aren't brave enough to let it develop. It can be pretty scary. And a lot of times I will conceptually have ideas for books that never come to anything. It's like an egg that hasn't been fertilized. But if I get an image, a mental image, then I know I'm going to write a book. And I can tell you the basic beginning image of almost every book that I've done. The one in Obula Land is at the beginning. I saw a woman alone in the woods. Well, first I thought I was going to write a modern novel. And then that didn't suit me, and I just kept going back and back until I found a woman lost in the woods and started there. You don't do these things consciously. Just know that's right, that's where I should start. A single footprint lay alone. It seemed dropped from nowhere onto the underbrush between the black, muscular roots of the high tree which dominated the ragged, lonesome hollow. But a small hand, human, on a thin, root-like white arm, wavered over the indent, fluttered the leaves, and the print was gone. At twilight, a raccoon licked along the dry ground, sniffing the trail made by stains of blood, which had fallen as the foot had fallen, lightly, smelled and scratched like a dog, and ambled away the color of the shadows, disappearing through a world its own color. The night came down, and the trees were ghostly under a full moon. Tiny settlements of double lights defined their branches. Some appeared and disappeared like stars. Some were as constant as planets, blinking out only as eyes blink after staring. The night stretched on, and even sleep could not blot out the universe of watchers. Inside the tree, huddled among the brush, plumped up the way a woman would plump a pillow. A small something alive could be heard from time to time, though not seen even by the wildcats, the wolverines, the panthers that crouched on the sea of branches. That it was a woman was certain from the thin arm, from the small footprint, and now, in the lowest time of heavy night, from the catch of her breath and the wary light way she turned, quickly on the leaves as she could, careful of disturbing the pressing nothing of the outside night, turned and listened, turned again, stopped and listened, waited still in the black tree for the sound of moving, a footfall, the startled crack of a twig, waited for the rhythm of breathing. Night came early still in August. The eyes of the night animals went out, faded with the first paleness which the thick trees let filter down. The whole wilderness seemed as quiet as the holding of a huge breath. And suddenly, the sun pierced once from high above, a thin watery line, and the air was filled with the shrieking of birds. The woman thrashed awake and screamed as if her head itself had burst into great jostling morning noise, but she had slept. And that was the true stripping down of the first Hannah. And to build from there, because that's the way we built this country, from there. Obula Land then takes it up in the mid-18th century, when the exile is not political but economic, and people are land hungry. And by the way, that's the reason that it's called the Beulah Quintet, because of the hymn, O Beulah Land, which is the most wonderful land-hungry hymn. I look away across the sea where mansions are prepared for me and view the shining glory shore, my heaven, my home forevermore. That is land-hungry cry, isn't it? It was almost an obsession. It was a sustained question. Why? I started with Obula Land, thinking I'd gone back far enough. And then, as I progressed, it became a trio. And it hadn't gone far enough. I still wasn't satisfied with it. Then I realized that I still hadn't found our language, because, as you know, the language changes in all the books. I still hadn't found that basic language of democracy. That already, in the 18th century, people were taking this language for granted. I wanted to go back to a place where it was new. I think it inspired me to seek deeper and find that book, which is, by the way, my favorite of all my books, Prisons, except the one I've just written. The family is not linear. It keeps being added to and subtracted from and changing and so on. Certain names run down through it. There are curious places that are autobiographical. The house of Beulah Land certainly is the house of my mother's family, the physical house. But they didn't come there that early. They came as land speculators. The language of Mary Rose and Lily and, the wonderful drunken sister who survived them all, I love her. That was the language that my mother and her sisters spoke. So I remembered hearing that as a child. Yes, they were clinging to a gentility, keep the coal dust off their white dresses. Our mountain gentility is, as you know, very forceful series of paranoid attitudes. So there were details like that. Of course, Hannah in the last book has written the first 4 books. But that Hannah and I have very little in common. I think one of my favorite lines in the quintet is, my sister Lily went to Vassar and came back an atheistical socialist. Remember, I saw, in my lifetime, I saw what had been a virgin country decimated by industry. And I think I was marked by it. And also, I got sick of the legends of history. I think the reality of our history is so much stronger, so much more to be proud of and ashamed of than the sort of pacified, cleaned up legend of our history. I want to know where I came from, what I was doing here, why I had the attitudes, the trained, received attitudes that I had. I questioned all of them, and a lot I threw out. I was only born in West Virginia because my father had a mine on Straight Creek in Bell County, Kentucky, and it was right on the border of Harlan County, and he didn't want me born in Harlan County. So my mother came back to Charleston, West Virginia, to the Kanawha Valley where her family were. And I was born there, but I was taken back to Pineville in Bell County when I was about a month old. And I was there till I was 7, so really the most formative years of my life were in Kentucky. And then we went to Florida for a couple of years, and then the Depression hit everybody, and we came back to West Virginia. And I lived in West Virginia from the time I was 11 until I was sent off to Sweetbriar when I was 18. And I went to Sweetbriar, which wasn't the right place for me to be in at all. And after 2 years, I flew the coop. So I'm a Sweetbriar dropout. Where do you go? You go to New York. And then I went to war. I married an Englishman at the beginning of the war, the 1939 war. And I had a son, so I left my son with my parents in West Virginia, and I joined the Women's Auxiliary Air Force of the Royal Air Force. See, I was a dual national, so I could do that. I also, and this I take great pride in, I've had lots of honorary degrees and so forth and so on, but the fact that my dossier in the State Department reads that I am a premature anti-fascist pleases me more than anything else. That meant that I was concerned with what was going on in the world before Pearl Harbor. Well, I was in the WAF. I wasn't a very good WAF. I stayed aircraft woman second class 2146391 the whole time I was in, and then I transferred into the American Office of War Information in London. And I was already writing, and I came back to this country, and one of the editors of Harper's Bazaar, who was working for the Office of War Information, sent me to Harper's Bazaar, and I had a job there, but I only lasted for 3 months because I suddenly realized that I didn't want to be a lady editor. I wanted to write books. I'm tired now because I just finished an enormous novel. But, you know, I'll spring back. I always do. It's dedicated to Southern liberals, past and present, wherever they may be, on the principle that most of them have had to leave town. Of course, I didn't know a Southern liberal was going to be president when the book came out. I've always said there's a mountain kingdom in this country, and it goes from Wheeling down to East Tennessee. And we all belong together. We're all more alike than we are like other people. My husband says you can't rule anybody born above 5,000 feet. So I think that in the mountain kingdom this is true. I'll read when Melinda, who is Melinda Craig, ex-debutante from Richmond, Virginia, whose first act of rebellion is to be carried feet first out of her coming out party at the Country Club of Virginia in 1929, dead drunk on bathtub gin. Her mother thinks she's fainted from doing the Charleston too fast. She's never looked back. She has volunteered in 1931 for the Red Cross to go out and help with the Red Cross during the strike known as Bloody Harlan, which is, if you know anything about Harlan County, you know Bloody comes just before Harlan. So this innocent child who's about as politically astute as Bambi, age 20, starts out for Harlan County, Kentucky. As Melinda got nearer the Kentucky border, the roads got worse. She could hear the things in the rumble seat shift as she drove slowly around the S-curves of the mountains, blowing ooga on her horn as her father had taught her. At least it didn't rain, but it had. The mountain meadows and the trees were green, the first real green she'd seen in her whole 400 miles. It was evening, too late to try to cross the last mountain, and down in the valley, where a large lawn was made bright green by the twilight, and the Althea mast high like a hedge caught the evening sun, she saw a white two-story house, a big one with long porches, trimmed with wooden lace upstairs and downstairs across the front. As she drove nearer, she saw a sign that said, Mrs. Hightower. That was all. She parked the car and sat for a minute and realized how exhausted she was. Mrs. Hightower didn't stop to draw breath. She just trudged on slowly through what she had to say as she changed dishes, gave them more coffee, ran water in the sink. Nice people there, real rich, some of them. Others has gone bankrupt. My husband and me and Hewlett, that's my boy, we never had but the one. My womb got twisted up. We lived over there for 5 years. Mr. Hightower was a foreman up Straight Creek, but they went bankrupt, and then he got himself a job on the coal face. He got mashed in the mine over to Everett's, a bad mine run by the Peabody Coal Company, one of them outside interests. Just to get a little cash money, well, he got mashed in the mine by one of them old tree trunks they call kettles, just stuck there in the ceiling and waiting to come down. People say they're thousands of years old, petrified, but I don't believe that. God made the world in 6 days, 1,004 years before Jesus, and on the 7th day he rested. He lasted a year all crippled up. My husband, not God. She laughed at that. And not 1 red cent of compensation, then he died. That's why we're for the union, not this here union, the Mother Jones union. But them coal operators run the UMWA out of Kentucky. This here one is Russian red. My husband voted for Eugene Debs every time he run, but I vote Republican. My daddy was a Republican. It runs in the family. So me and Hewlett, we come home to my daddy. I was raised right here in this house. I turned it into a hotel. Daddy didn't like it, but there wasn't nothing else to do. All the outside interests come here to eat. But I keep my mouth shut. I mean about conditions. Terrible.
Mr. Peabody's coal train is hauled away.
Would you tell me more about Straight Creek? Melinda got the question in when Mrs. Hightower finally paused for breath. She was shy about asking. She still didn't know how to answer when people asked her what she was doing. Oh, that place. That's where Mr. Hightower was foreman, Dudley Mine, named after the owner's wife. They went to Florida. You stay out of Straight Creek. Mines is shut down. The people up there's in real trouble. Mellon or Rockefeller or one of them bought up most of the Straight Creek mines when they went bust. But they ain't done nothing with them. Oh, a couple of days' work a week, maybe. Mrs. Hightower ran her tongue around her gold tooth to see if it was still there. It sure as hell ain't pretty up Straight Creek. You just wait. One good thing is, though, the Bell County Sheriff don't let none of them thugs into Straight Creek. Not yet, anyhow. She laughed, longer than Melinda wished she would, and drank her coffee with a big gulp. You'll be all right, she said, dumping the plates and cups in the dishpan. Just stay at the Continental Hotel. Ask anybody where the Red Cross is. They got in one of them operators' office. That ought to tell you something. She leaned against the sink and stared at Melinda. Lord's love. What in the world you get yourself into this mess? A pretty girl like you used to nice things. Oh, I know. You got to be there, ain't you? My husband used to say you can argue all day long, but when you wake up 3 o'clock in the morning, a thing is wrong or it's right, and you take to drink or do something about it, one. That's what he said when he voted for Eugene V. Debs. You're one of them gets pulled to where it's at, ain't you? I bet you never give it a real thought what you was getting into. Just signed on. There's people like that. You're going to be that way all your life, you poor little old thing. Well, that can be good or bad, depends on the place and the time and who gets a hold of you. You watch out, though, you hear me? Them mine guards is nothing but trash. Gun thugs hard by the companies. People is a-boiling mad out there. There's a lot of miners in jail, they say, murdered or had criminal syndical or something like that. All trumped up. The Red Cross won't feed nobody's been blacklisted. That's miners that tried to join the UMWA. And them that's joined the NMU, that's the communist one. Them places out there is ripe for Russian Reds. It makes me so goddamn mad I could spit nails. She slammed a cup into the sink so hard she broke it. Just fly red. Thank you. And I think what kind of kicked me into writing this book, way, way long time ago, before I knew I was going to write it, was I used the word liberal in Washington, and somebody said, you don't use the L word in Washington. And this made me madder than a wet hen, because it's an honorable word, and we have allowed it to become a pejorative word. And we've only allowed this to happen. It shouldn't happen. It's a fine word, because it talks about giving the other person a chance to have an opinion. You know what I was trying to do? All through the 20th century, these choices have had to be made by people. And the only people we know about are the people who are either well-known or made a career out of it, so they got a lot of publicity. But there were always people behind them in those pictures. Always people nobody knew. And Melinda describes herself in the beginning of this book, the other person in the picture is me. I'm writing about the other people in the picture that made these choices but didn't make a thing out of them, just did it. Well, thank you all very much for coming. Thanks. My husband and I went to Harlan and Bell counties a couple of years ago I was doing some research on the book I've just finished. And there aren't any beautiful mountains anymore. Mr. Peabody's coal train has hauled them away.
Then the coal company came with the world's largest shovel, and they tortured the timber and stripped all the land. Well, they dug for their coal till the land was forsaken. Then they wrote it all down as the progress of man. And Daddy, won't you take me back to Muhlenberg County, down by the Green River where paradise lay? Well, I'm sorry, my son, but you're too late in asking. Mr. Peabody's coal train has hauled it away.
I think what's happened in the mountains is tragic. You know that song? Oh, I tell you, I remember sitting in the back of a boat in the Aegean, and we'd all been diving, and it was somebody from the American consul in Istanbul had brought some bluegrass music. I was just crying and sitting in the stern of this boat in the Aegean, listening to Mr. Peabody's coal train. My father's first job as a mining engineer was in a mine in the Kanawha Valley where there was not one word of English spoken. It was all Italian. And he said that those Italian people that came over made gardens and walls, raised vineyards, everything up in those hollows. And my God, you should see them now. Just they were stripped out and ruined. I feel fairly strongly on this subject. The me that came back was the me that had grown up there, to myself. But to other people, I was somebody who had gone away and gotten a lot of highfalutin ideas and wasn't behaving like a sweetbriar girl anymore and asking too many questions. There was a German girl called the nasty girl. That's what I was treated like. It was an appalling experience. And now, of course, I go back and they give me prizes like that damn thing up there, and 3,000 people come to hear me talk. And if they realized that when I leave, I just want to go. People treat their own very badly in this country. We were talking in the beginning about something called the creative impulse, and I said it was dangerous. That's what I meant. For a Southerner, it tends to be dangerous, especially for a mountain Southerner. because you don't break the genteel rules. We have barriers to get over. They're not barriers, they're almost moats, aren't they, of understanding. I remember when I was working on The Scapegoat, I was in a pool at Warm Springs, and somebody that I knew whose husband was a very rich coal owner said, "I hope you tell the truth about the coal industry, I mean our side." And I thought, there isn't any side. There isn't any side.
Series, Tell It on the Mountain, and this feature on the life and work of writer Mary Lee Settle was produced by Maxine Kenny at WMMT, the public radio station of Appalshop in Whitesburg, Kentucky. Settle read from Old Beulah Land, Viking, and Choices Doubleday. Special thanks for the production help of Gary Slimp, Kate Larkin, and Stephanie Whetstone. Funding for this series was provided by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, the National Endowment for the Arts, the Kentucky Arts Council, the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Virginia Foundation for the Humanities and Public Policy, and the State Humanities Councils of Kentucky, West Virginia, and Tennessee.
You've been listening to Tell It on the Mountain, a radio series originally produced back in 1995 by then-WMMT producer Maxine Kenny, and the series was hosted by Nikki Giovanni. Each episode of Tell It on the Mountain showcases different Appalachian women writers, including Mary Lee Settle and Barbara Kingsolver, who we heard from today, alongside other names like Wilma Dykeman, Bobby Ann Mason, George Ella Lyon, and many more. If you enjoyed what you heard today, keep an ear out, because while this series was originally just released on cassette tape, we here at Appalshop will be digitally re-releasing the whole series soon. In the meantime, that's it for Mountain Talk today. Thanks so much for listening. For WMMT, I'm Parker Hobson.